Colm Tóibín is an award-winning Irish novelist, short story writer, essayist, playwright, journalist, critic, and poet. He began writing at the age of 12, and after graduating from University College Dublin, moved to Barcelona, where he taught English for 3 years before returning to Ireland to begin a career in journalism. From the late 70s to early 80s, he worked as a columnist and editor for several Irish papers and magazines, ultimately becoming the editor of McGill, Ireland's leading current affairs magazine, during its heyday in the early 80s. After leaving the magazine, he moved to South America, settling in Argentina, where he wrote about the trial of President Galtieri and other authorities accused of human rights violations. In 1987, he published Walking Along the Border, an account of a journey by foot along the border between Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland, which was the first of many travelogues he published between his novels, the first of which, The South, was completed in 1986, but not published until 1990, when it was met with widespread acclaim. His many, many other lauded works include The Master, about Henry James, which won the Los Angeles Times Book Prize for Fiction and other awards. He is also the author of Brooklyn, which won the Costa Fiction Award and was later made into a highly acclaimed motion picture. Tóibín is a regular contributor to the London and the New York reviews of books and is taught at the New School, at Princeton, at Stanford, at the University of Texas at Austin, and he's currently the Irene and Sidney B. Silverman Professor of Humanities at Columbia. His books have been translated into more than 30 languages, and I just learned today he is also embarking on a career as a museum curator. He is curating a show entitled Henry James and American Painting, which will open June 8th at the Morgan Library in New York, and then move on to the Elizabeth Stewart Gardner Museum in Boston. His most recent novel, The House of Names, is a gripping retelling of the story of Clytemnestra and her children, just released this month. Already, critics have praised it as heart-stopping, a violent page-turner about the mother of all dysfunctional families, and the insidious ravages of revenge and distrust, an intimate saga of suffering, and a creative reanimation of these indelible characters who are still breathing down our necks across the millennia. Light fare for a Saturday afternoon. In any case, Tóibín has been praised as a gorgeous stylist, capturing the subtle flutterings of consciousness better than any writer alive today. So please join me in welcoming Colm Tóibín to the Getty Villa.
Thank you very much for coming. I want to invoke a moment at the beginning of the 20th century when the Irish woman, Lady Gregory, was having supper with friends of hers whose political views began to differ from hers, and they were remonstrating with her for moving in the direction of Irish nationalism. What actually happened, Lady Gregory was born in the west of Ireland in 1852, and when she was 30, she married a man who was 35 years older than her, and he left her a widow at the age of 40. So in 1892, she's a widow. And what she begins to do, although she's somebody who's welcome in many houses in London, she's a friend of Henry James's. Her husband had been a director of the National Gallery in London. She has a house still in the west of Ireland called Cool Park. And she could easily have moved between her house in London and her house in the west of Ireland and attended many grand dinners in Dublin Castle or indeed in Buckingham Palace. But what she decided to do instead was to learn Irish. And in the New York Public Library, in the Berg collection, we can see her notebooks. And she's writing out carefully each word, tá, on bow, ag dul, goodie, on dober, the the cow is going to the well. And of course, if she needed a word, she had the Bible. She knew the Bible, as a good Irish Protestant, she knew the Bible very well in English. So she had the Bible beside her in Irish, a translation. She could check one word against another. But if she needed to find out something more, she just sent out to one of her farmhands or one of her tenants, because she owned a big estate. What's this word? What does that word mean? And then she realized slowly that among her tenants, among the people who were living and paying her rent on her estate, were people who were in possession of an extraordinary range of folklore and mythological tales, and that these had been passed down from generation to generation in an intact oral tradition. And she began to move from house to house. I'm talking about the smallest house, a 2-room house where there was some old person sitting by a fireplace who would have a story. Now, what she also discovered was that these stories had in fact been written down. And their importance was that they had remained in the oral tradition to some extent, but they also had been written down. That when Christianity came to Ireland in the 5th century, there was no obvious friction at the beginning or at any time between pagan tradition and Christian tradition. For example, Croagh Patrick in the west of Ireland in County Mayo, it was a pagan mountain until Christianity came, and then it became a Christian mountain. It was as though this happened without any particular difficulty. In other words, there are no martyrs in the early Irish Church. Obviously, there must have been some difficulty, some moments where the pagans wanted their day and the Christians their day. But if you go there now, even on the last Sunday of July, and see thousands of people walking up the top of the mountain, which overlooks Clew Bay in the west of Ireland, it's absolutely clear that this was a great pagan site. And obviously, it's, since the arrival of Christianity, it's been a Christian site. What happened with the development of Christianity in Ireland, say in the 6th, 7th and 8th centuries, was that they began to acquire monasteries and build monasteries. And the monasteries became wealthy. And they began to use certain monks as scribes. And the monks began to write down the stories that were being told all around them. So that we have, for example, in Trinity College in Dublin, in the Royal Irish Academy, and also in Oxford, actual manuscripts dating from the 6th, 7th, 8th centuries, and then copies of those manuscripts done in the 9th, 10th, 11th centuries. For example, my name, which is Colm, I'm called after St. Colm Kill. And I suppose he's the great first saint of copyright. In that he was a monk, and he went to another monastery, and he saw a manuscript, and he thought he'd like to make a copy of it. So he sat day and night making a copy of it. And then as he was leaving, he said, "Well, thank you." And they said, "Well, no, thank you for making the copy, but you leave the copy here behind you as well." And he said, "No, I want the copy. I made the copy." And so there was an enormous, I suppose, a sort of a Supreme Court decision, as it were. And they said that in the end, to the cow, her calf was the decision. And he was exiled to Iona, off the north coast of Scotland. And he only came back to Ireland once. And I used to love this story when I was a kid, that that he wasn't allowed ever set foot in Ireland again because of his cheek. And he had to put the soil of Iona into his shoes, because he could only step on the soil of Iona. I mean, they were very good about it, and that he therefore could come back to Ireland once. But these manuscripts then were very well protected in Trinity College Dublin, in the Royal Irish Academy in Dawson Street in Dublin, and in Oxford, and in various other places. In the 19th century, scholars began to work on them, but in a dispassionate way, attempting to, for example, do editions of them, do scholarly editions of them. But by the end of the 19th century, when, for example, the figure of Lady Gregory began to work on them, she realized that she was dealing with political dynamite. That if it could be established that these stories, that these manuscripts, that they were Irish, that they would exalt the idea of Ireland, that they would establish in everyone's mind fully that there was an ancient Irish culture which had once been intact before it was, as it were, destroyed by outsiders, by the Danes, by the Normans, and of course by the English. And that, so that when her friend said to her this particular evening, what you're doing is really dangerous, because these poor people who are suffering so much from emigration, who have gone through a famine, who are living in tiny places, you are attempting to suggest to them that they come from a very rich culture. These people have no culture. They merely speak Irish, and that's no use to them. And it used to be said about Irish that you couldn't sell a pig in Irish. You needed English for that purpose. So that even the language itself was seen as a degraded thing. And Lady Gregory simply said to her friends, Old Irish, the actual language that I'm translating from, is as close to modern Irish as ancient Greek is to modern Greek. And the people who are speaking outside are tenants, the people who are living in the small cottages, that they actually are using the same words as are in these ancient manuscripts. And some of them have the same stories as told to them. And that, of course, people who she was speaking to would have understood the implications. If you're saying that you wish to invoke an Ireland, an ancient Ireland, for the purposes of political activity, and if you're mentioning the Greek experience in this case, you're talking about nationalism. You're talking about a country attempting to wrest itself from an empire, as the Greeks had attempted to do from the Ottoman Empire, to found a state in the name, using an idea of an ancient entity which people still belong to, despite the passing of centuries, or despite the changing, indeed, of the language, or indeed of many other things. So that as Lady Gregory began to work on her translations, she realized that she was, the phrase that she used was that she was adding dignity to Ireland. But what she was actually doing was she was giving nationalists in Ireland an idea that if they wanted a free and independent Irish state, free from England, they should stop talking about economic reasons for wanting this. And they should start talking about cultural reasons. That Ireland was, before England was even thought of as a culture, before Shakespeare was even imagined, Ireland had an ancient and intact and extremely valuable culture, and the signs of this were in the libraries. So the art or the act of translation became, around 1900, a deeply political act, which would inspire people to say, not only do I want independence from England because I feel different to England, or I will be richer if Ireland is independent, but somehow or other, my Irishness, my entire personality as an Irish person will connect to that ancient Ireland and be enriched by knowledge that even though I myself am poor, I come from a tradition which is immensely rich and immensely valuable. And so she began to work. And of course, one of the problems they had was there was no tradition in theatre. That she was absolutely alert of the importance that Greek theatre had in the creation of the modern Greek imagination, of those figures of Medea, Electra, Antigone, Oedipus, actually mattering in the building up of Greek nationalism. And that what was needed in Ireland, since they didn't have a theatrical tradition, she decided to invent one. And in 1898, she met the poet W.B. Yeats, who was in his 30s. He was a floppy-haired poet, mainly living in London. She met him in the west of Ireland. Arthur Symonds, who was there when they met, said, "Once she cast her terrible eye on him, I knew she would keep him." She was a very determined person. She had a big house with a lot of paintings, with a big library. Her only son was living mainly in London. And for W.B. Yeats, she had something that he desperately needed. She had a typewriter. And at the beginning, he saw her as having great value to him because he came from 1898 until his late marriage in 1917. W.B. Yeats spent 4 or 5 months of the year actually living in her house. He had the master bedroom, he sat at the head of the table, and he had the run of the library. And of course, she would bring him out in the day to meet her tenants, and she would translate for him what the tenants were saying. And the tenants had stories of ancient Ireland that went back to before Christianity. As I said, stories that had been written down along the way, but had also survived orally. And at one point, her son came back from England and went down into the cellars. And his father had laid down a wonderful wine cellar over the years, and all the wine was gone. And he said to his mother, "Where's all our wine?" And she said, "Oh, W.B. Yeats." So she had to write him a letter. And again, there's a letter in the Berg, in the New York Public Library, saying, "Next year when you come, I wonder if you could perhaps bring your own wine, because you've used up all of ours." So what she gave him was, she gave him absolute peace and harmony for 4 or 5 months of the year. And also she connected him to this ancient world which was all around her. And then the two of them began to dream of this theatre that they would make, which was founded in 1904 and is still there as the Abbey Theatre, or the National Theatre of Ireland. And they got the patent because it was very difficult. You couldn't just build a theatre. There was serious legislation governing theatres. They got a patent to create the theatre to put on only new Irish work. And nobody thought that would matter because there wasn't any Irish work. We didn't have, I mean, the playwrights who were, for example, who were still living, or who had been the contemporary Irish playwrights, George Bernard Shaw, for example, or Oscar Wilde, had gone to London, had produced their plays in London. And even in the earlier centuries, a figure like Sheridan had gone to London. That there was no tradition of putting on new Irish plays in Ireland. We didn't have a rich 16th century. We had a disastrous 16th century. And therefore, what had to happen was the plays had to be written anew. The plays had to be made from the very beginning. But Yeats and Lady Gregory understood, as they produced new Irish plays in their theatre, that they were not merely entertaining people. This was not their purpose. Their purpose was to imagine a country, or was to imagine a nation. And this, of course, if you were a nationalist watching this had immense political implications, which led, of course, to the 1916 rebellion and led in 1922 to the independence of the south of Ireland it was the first country to be let loose from the British Empire. But this was not done by a group of economists. This was not done by a group of politicians. This was imagined by a group of poets and translators who set about attempting to fire up the spirit of people, using the experience of what had happened in Greece to say, you are connected to something that is ancient and valuable. Now, this made its way, obviously, into the public realm, courtesy of archaeology, as well as translation. And the father of Oscar Wilde, Sir William Wilde, was an important amateur archaeologist and antiquarian. And we see him, he's in the Aran Islands off the west of Ireland in the 1850s. And he and his wife, again, becomes a very early transcriber of stories that she hears from the west of Ireland, and attempting, both of them, to do something quite strange, which is what Yeats and Lady Gregory would later do, which is to have a strange set of allegiances, a sort of gnarled set of allegiances. While they were Protestants in Ireland, part of the ruling class in Dublin, they were lending their power to an Ireland of the future. This didn't stop them collecting rents. I mean, Lady Gregory was particularly good at making sure that all her tenants, no matter what stories they have or didn't have, that they paid their rents on time. And she threatened them with eviction at various times. And the Wildes also owned various property. But for all of them, they had an idea that they were living in a country which was going to change. And they wanted to be at the forefront of the change. And so for the Wildes, their son Oscar, he went to Trinity College Dublin, which is a bastion of English privilege and power in Ireland. But it was also where he studied classics, and it was also where he studied Greek. And for example, we have him as a student writing about Euripides. And we have him in an essay in 1887 writing, "For though Euripides has not the Titan strength of Aeschylus, that Michelangelo of the Athenian stage, nor the self-restraint and artistic reserve of Sophocles, yet he has qualities that are absolutely and entirely his own. His broad acceptance of the actual facts of life, his extraordinary psychological insight into the workings of the human mind, his keen dramatic instinct for some scene and situation, and his freedom from theological prejudice make him the most interesting of studies. He was a poet, a philosopher, and a playwright. The most modern of all the ancients, there is something of Browning in him, and not a little of Dumas fil. If he broke with the traditions of the Greek stage, at least he made meander inevitable. If he sets passion above perfection, he is, for that reason, all the more human. Though he dissects life, he never desecrates it. And the mere fact that the dramatic critics of his day spoke of him as an immoral writer shows how ethical was the impulse that stirred him." This Wilde at his most Wildean already in 1887. He saw indeed that men and women as they are more interesting than men and women as they ought to be. He never tried to make humanity real by exaggerating its proportions. He cared little for giants or for gods. The sorrows of mortals touched him more than all the gladness of Olympus. And it's interesting to note, for example, that one of the most famous scenes in Oscar Wilde's The Importance of Being Earnest is the whole idea of the boy who's been lost, who's been found and was found in a handbag. And there's a famous moment where Lady Bracknell says, "A handbag." And that scholars have been able to trace the original of this from a play that is actually by Euripides. And that Wilde actually took this from Eon, where there's a child found in a basket, and that so that he was working. He went to Greece. He actually looked at archaeological sites in Greece as a young man. And if you look at De Profundis, for example, the long letter that he wrote in prison is filled with Greek phrases, or it's filled with Greek references. In the meantime, the Abbey Theatre is thriving, and W.B. Yeats is beginning to translate the Oedipus plays. Also, W.B. Yeats is famously in love with the firebrand revolutionary who's called Maud Gonne. And of course, he wishes to marry her, and she's constantly turning him down. And she becomes, in a way, his muse, his doomed muse, the woman he cannot marry. And he can write these great love poems to her without having to settle down, into domestic disharmony with her, as clearly would have occurred. I don't think she was made particularly for marriage, and so he didn't have to, he didn't have to see her in the morning. He just saw her at night sometimes when she was willing to see him. But he did, what was interesting was that Lady Gregory was asked at one point, "Are you working for Home Rule?" Because Home Rule was associated with sort of violence and firebrands in Ireland. And she said, no. She was always very wise, Lady Gregory. She said, "No, I'm working for after Home Rule." In other words, what she was attempting to build was a culture in Ireland and was a sense of dignity and idealism in Ireland. Whereas what Maud Gonne wanted was very close to what Oscar Wilde's mother wanted. She wanted revolution in Ireland. And so when Yeats attempts to deplore in a poem the woman he loves, who he wants to, in a way, domesticate, he wants to marry, he wants to have children with, and she's instead going around the country making speeches and trying to stir people up towards revolution, he writes a short poem to her, and he invokes Troy. He invokes Helen of Troy. He invokes her beauty as the beauty of Helen of Troy, but also the amount of trouble she causes as being close to the amount of trouble that Helen of Troy caused. The poem is called No Second Troy. Why should I blame her that she filled my days with misery, or that she would of late have taught to ignorant men most violent ways, or hurled the little streets upon the great, had they but courage equal to desire? What could have made her peaceful with a mind that nobleness made simple as a fire, with beauty like a tightened bow, a kind that is not natural in an age like this, being high and solitary and most stern? Why, what could she have done being what she is? Was there another Troy for her to burn? And when Lady Gregory produced her famous translation of the Tóibín, which is, I suppose, our Homer, is the Irish is the book that describes Irish heroes and warriors in the pre-Christian era. It was an international bestseller. It was read by the President of the United States. And it set up the idea of this lone warrior who was called Cuchulainn, and that he was not afraid of death, and he would only operate alone. He was not in any way socialized, and he would sacrifice himself for anything. And he became this figure of Cuchulainn. Became the inspiration, actually, for the 1916 rebellion. So that later on, in a poem, W.B. Yeats begins to worry about plays of his that had been written about the warrior Cuchulainn, whose inspiration had come from Lady Gregory's translations, but who, as I say, they were always conscious that this idea of translating text, of using the theatre, of suggesting an ancient culture, had large connections with what had happened in Greece. That he wrote, did those words of mine send out certain men the English shot? Because he was sure that one particular play of his that had invoked heroism, that had suggested ancient heroes, had inspired a great number of young men who took part in that rebellion. But once peace broke out in Ireland, W.B. Yeats, in 1923, he was a senator, he had won the Nobel Prize. His main interest at this time was disrupting the peace, was seeing if there was anything he could now do to stop his own respectability, sort of poisoning him or eating him alive. He had another 16 years to live, and by God did he want to cause trouble in this time. And so he wrote a poem which was referred to as Senator Yates's filthy swan poem, in the newspapers, but it wasn't. It was, he had looked at what was happening in Italy and the cataclysms that had resulted from the First World War in Russia and in Italy, and that he felt was going to sort of take over Europe. And he published this poem in 1923 called Leda and the Swan. A sudden blow, the great wings beating still above the staggering girl, her thighs caressed by the dark webs, her nape caught in his bill. He holds her helpless breast upon his breast. How can those terrified vague fingers push the feathered glory from her loosening thighs? And how can body laid in that white rush but feel the strange heart beating where it lies? A shudder in the loins engenders there the broken wall, the burning roof and tower, and Agamemnon dead. Being so caught up, so mastered by the brute blood of the air, did she put on his knowledge with his power before the indifferent beak could let her drop? And that line, and Agamemnon dead, of course, that what Yeats is suggesting was that one act, the rape of Leda, had led in turn to the killing of Agamemnon by his wife, who was Clytemnestra. And so I want to end by reading two short pieces from this novel, House of Names. And the first one is the immediate aftermath, when Clytemnestra has finally killed Agamemnon. He has lured her, or he had lured her years earlier, with her daughter Iphigenia to the place of sacrifice, telling her that Iphigenia was in fact to be married to Achilles the warrior. And what she had decided to do in retaliation was to wait until he came home. And in my version of the story, to catch him at that moment, I think when men are perhaps at their most vulnerable, when you have one foot in the bath and the other foot almost in the bath. And she got him at that moment. and she had killed him as she had killed Cassandra, and she had ordered that their bodies be left out in the sun so everyone could see them. And so this is the opening of the novel in the aftermath of that killing. And it's spoken by Clytemnestra. I have been acquainted with the smell of death, the sickly, sugary smell that wafted in the wind towards the rooms in this palace. It is easy now for me to feel peaceful and content. I spend my morning looking at the sky and the changing light. The bird's song begins to rise as the world fills with its own pleasures. And then as day wanes, the sound too wanes and fades. I watch as the shadows lengthen. So much has slipped away, but the smell of death lingers. Maybe the smell has entered my body and been welcomed there like an old friend come to visit. The smell of fear and panic. The smell is here like the very air is here. It returns in the same way as light in the morning returns. It is my constant companion. It has put life into my eyes, eyes that grew dull with waiting, but are not dull now, eyes that are alive now with brightness. I gave orders that the bodies should remain in the open under the sun a day or two until the sweetness gave way to stench. And I liked the flies that came, their little bodies perplexed and brave, buzzing after their feast, upset by the continuing hunger they felt in themselves, a hunger that I had come to know too and had come to appreciate. We are all hungry now. Food merely whets our appetite. It sharpens our teeth. Meat makes us ravenous for more meat, as death is ravenous for more death. Murder makes us ravenous, fills the soul with satisfaction that is fierce and then luscious enough to create a taste for further satisfaction. A knife piercing the flesh under the ear with intimacy and precision, and then moving across the throat as soundlessly as the sun moves across the sky, but with greater speed and zeal, and then his dark blood flowing with the same inevitable hush as dark night falls on familiar things. And as I was writing the book, I realized how much that Shakespeare had taken from this story in the creation, for example, of Macbeth, the whole idea of a killing of a king, in the creation of Coriolanus, but also in the creation, I think especially of Hamlet, that after the killing of Agamemnon by his wife Clytemnestra, what she wants, or what she asks in my book is really, she wants her son Orestes, who's about 12, to be taken away. She really doesn't want him to witness the murder of his father. She just wants him taken away from the palace for that day. He can come back after when it's done. But of course he's kidnapped. And then he and two boys manage to escape. And then they are looked after by an old woman in a place by the sea for many years. And then they finally, when the old woman dies and one of their friends die, they decide it's time to go home. And they eventually come home. And Orestes, there's in the Greek originals, there's really no one to tell you where he was when he was away. So for me, it was very useful as a novelist because there was nothing to go on. Therefore, I could invent it all. Also his personality, he's often presented as heroic. And there were times when I was working when I wished I was a Greek playwright, when I really, thought it'd be such fun if I could just, how do you get someone to kill his mother in a modern novel? In a Greek play, it's really easy. You just get the mother to go off stage, and you get the son to follow her with a knife. You have some screaming, and then you have him coming on with blood on the knife. Well, then it's over. Well, try that in a modern novel. So you have to sort of build up the whole idea of him as someone who's easily led, as someone who is, he has no strategy. All around him, his sister Electra is filled with strategy. His mother has strategy. Aegisthus, his mother's lover, is all strategy. His father, Agamemnon. But he somehow has no strategy. He follows. People like him. He will do what he's told. And therefore, he's a sort of lethal weapon because he will, under certain pressures, do anything at all. And under these pressures, he kills his mother. The problem I had then was, what do you do the next page? You have someone killing his mother and she dies. All the life goes out of her and he's there. What can he do that night? Is he going to have dinner? Is he going to meet his sister? Is he going to go to his room on his own? How's he going to feel? And no matter what I thought it's not right, because he'll feel 100 different things. He'll feel nothing, everything. And so I went back to look at Hamlet, and I realized, of course, the ghost, that those scenes are so important in Hamlet, where the supernatural is let into the play, even though the play is so filled with Hamlet's wit, with Hamlet's will, and with Hamlet's indecision, and with Hamlet's playfulness, with his full humanity, as it were, that the fact that supernatural is there almost sets out to heighten the human things that are in Hamlet. And then, so this is the last bit I'm going to read. It's, you turn the page, and it's Clytemnestra, and it's her ghost in the aftermath of her killing. And we need to remember two things, that she is also the daughter of Leda. And she's also, she has been killed in a garden, or with steps down to a garden, by her son. But earlier on in the book, both Iphigenia and Agamemnon appear as ghosts to Electra, but they have no memory of how they were killed. They're not back in the world seeking revenge for that, or wanting to deal with it. It's something else they're looking for in the world. And so too with Clytemnestra, she has no memory of the knife or exactly how she was killed. It comes to her for a second, but not in any real way or any important way. But this is her ghost. There will come a time when the shadows fold in on me, I know that. But I'm awake now, or almost awake. I remember some things, outlines come to me, and the faint sound of voices. What linger most are traces of people, presences, sounds. Mostly I walk among the shades, but sometimes a hint of someone comes close, someone whose name I once knew, or whose voice and face were real to me. Someone I once loved, perhaps, I'm not sure. There is one remnant that comes and persists, however. It is my mother at some time in the distant past. She is helpless, being held down. I can hear cries, her cries, and the shriller cries of a figure above her or lying on her. And then louder cries as the figure flits away, a figure with beak and wings, with the shape of wings, the wings beating in the air, and my mother lying breathless, whimpering. But I do not know what this means or why it comes to me. I feel that if I remain still, something more will come. It is hard not to wander in these spaces where there is silence. There are presences I wish to encounter, presences that are close but not close enough to touch or be seen. I cannot think of their names. I cannot see faces clearly, although there are moments when I have been quiet, when I have made no effort for some time to remember or focus, moments when a face approaches, the face of someone I have known, but it fades before it becomes anyone I can recognize. I know that there was feeling, and that is the difference between where I am now and the place I was once. There was a time, I know, when I felt rage and I felt sorrow, but now I have lost what leads to rage and sorrow. Maybe the only reason I wander in these spaces has to do with some other feeling, or what is left of it. Maybe that feeling is love. There is someone whom I love still, or have loved and protected, but I cannot be sure of that. No name will come. Some words come, but not the words I want, which are the names. If I can say the names, I will know then whom I loved, and I will find them or know how to see them. I will lure them into the shadows when the time is right. No one in their world knows how little there is here. It is all blankness, strangeness, silence. Hardly anything moves. There are echoes like distant water flowing under rock, and then sometimes that sound comes nearer, but it is still faint. If I listen too eagerly, it disappears. Maybe there are things that did not come to an end when I was there, and they linger now like words that need to be said, or words that have escaped me and will come, or might come, or must come as I wait here. It will take time. I do not know how much time I have, or how much time there is, but I know that I must fade, that I cannot persist in this state. The fading will be gradual. By the end, I will not know anything. What I'm hoping for is one more surge, some hours or even moments, when I will go back into the world and settle into it briefly as though I were alive. In the meantime, there's memory, which connects and attaches and withdraws. It is almost something. A vague thought hovers, but is never stable, like a figure with wings that edges towards what has been or was. I live on the inside of what has substance. I can feel some large set of pressing desires brushing past. All I am left with, though, are the grey traces, the clues. This must be what shadow is like, or aftermath. Some lines or shapes that have made sense at one time, or may make sense, or may still make sense, but seem random now. If only I could follow what their intention was, or whisper to whoever made them. That desire is the closest I have come to pure feeling, and it is not close at all. I will be left here for the hours or days or years I have been allotted, no longer than that. Being perplexed and bewildered replaces truth and knowledge, replaces what is real and tangible. The space I inhabit is like a sad gift that was offered but will soon be withdrawn. And then a word occurred to me, a word of which I was sure. It was the word dream. Once the word came, I knew what dream was or had been, and I was certain then that I was not dreaming in this nullness, that none of what is happening is dream. It is real, it is actual. And then other words appeared like stars in the darkening sky. I became desperate to take possession of each one, but I could not hold on to them. They were falling or glittering or moving farther away. It was enough, however, to have seen them, to get some idea of their power, and know that some of them would return, and like the light from a full moon on a dark night, become part of a shadowy stability that was guiding me. I walked in the corridors of that palace where I had once lived. I could almost remember some things that had happened. There was an image of someone in a garden or on steps that led to a garden, staring hard, breathing hard, but then nothing. Just stillness in the garden. And then there was not even a garden, there was merely a space. But I was still awake. I was waiting, knowing that there would be change, that it would not always be like this. I was aware how easy it would be, once I was in those corridors again, for one of the guards to notice me if I made a sound or if I moved quickly, so that there would be some disturbance in the air. And then slowly, I began to understand why I was here and who I was looking for. His name did not come to me, and I was not able to picture his face, but I felt that he was close. I could imagine the guard who had seen me or who had noticed my presence consulting one of the other guards, and then both of them approaching him, the one I am searching for, or his friend who looks after him. My husband is dead, and my daughter. They have become pure shade. My other daughter is here, but the one I am searching for is my son. I am awake. The words I knew are sleeping. Sometimes they turn in the night or make some sound in their vast dreaming, and then they wake too. Often, if only for a second, they open their eyes and watch me. I hold their gaze so that they might remember me as they fall back into sleep. I study them in their inert state. I'm alert to any movement they make. I can hear their dark groanings in the night, intermittent against their breathing. I can see them reach their arms towards me to be lifted. I can tell the difference between night and day now. I know the silence that descends on the gardens and corridors at night, a silence broken only by the soft movements of the guards or of cats. This is my realm, where I am free to wander. As I come from the garden, I'm aware that the guards can feel a movement in the air. It would just take one more thing to let them know that I'm with them. A sound, a darting gesture. When the time came, I knew that I would hear his name, my son's name, enough to whisper it, like someone imploring. It would come to me when I needed it. Orestes, I whispered on one of those nights, and then I withdrew into the shadows. Orestes, I repeated, letting my voice echo down the corridor. I saw two of the guards running back and forth, and then summoning the other one, my son's friend, who strutted up and down, checking doorways and corners. I waited until he had gone, and then I whispered to one of the guards, "Tell Orestes that I am his mother. He must come alone into the corridor. He must be alone." The guard made as though to run, but then stopped himself. "Speak again," he said quietly, his head bowed. "Tell Orestes to come alone," I said. "Now?" he asked. "Soon. Orestes must come soon." "Do you mean to cause him harm?" "No, I do not mean to cause him harm." Thank you. Thank you. I think we have time for some questions, and we have mics at either side. And so if anyone has anything, maybe I've just reduced everyone to silence, but if anyone has any questions, yes, please, just here.
If Lady Gregory was holding on to the trying to revive the folk tales to give the Irish narrative, you're going back in history in writing this book and adding, what are you trying to tell us now?
I think that, I come from a country where there have been 2 civil wars in the 20th century. And my uncle was interned in the first Civil War. And my uncle lived until 1995, and I was very close to him, so that Civil War was very close to us and remained. The 2 main political parties in Ireland were based on that Civil War. My father used to say about the other political party, the one that wasn't ours, that you could salute them if you met them, but if you ever voted for them, your right hand would wither off. And with the Second War, which became known as the Troubles in Northern Ireland, I wrote that book where I walked along the border. And towards the end, especially when I came into South Armagh, this is on the eastern side, and I was on the northern side of the border, I really came across stories and things that had happened that made clear to me that this idea of the violence was a sort of spiral, that there was never an isolated killing. That if you said, well, what happened the week before, you realize that one killing was retaliation for a second killing. But then the third killing, they'd attempt to do something much more spectacular to actually really fill the imagination of people with fear. The third will always be the worst. And then it would go quiet, and then it would start again in retaliation for that. And the spiral you could not look at any case as an isolated case. The more questions you asked, the more you found out that once it began, getting it to stop was going to be really, really difficult. And obviously, when I was writing this book, it was during the war in Syria, for example, where I realized once more this whole idea of civil war. And so I was also interested in that idea that in the most innocent-seeming person, who is Orestes, who really just seems to want an easy life, who just is happiest living with the old woman and his 2 friends and the dog in this place beside the sea, vaguely thinking of home, vaguely missing home, that's where he's most content. But when he arrives back in the palace, his innocence is really no use to him. And that idea that I think we get from the Greek plays, which I think also mattered to Yeats and to Lady Gregory, because they were operating in a country that had known rebellions and that was actually facing into what would clearly be at some point a civil war over the future of Ireland. That violence within a family. Especially in that first civil war in Ireland, brothers fought against brothers, and brothers killed brothers. So that all of that is still there. It's absolutely, it is still with us. But it's also, these stories remain the bedrock for our society. These great plays still live with us. And I was interested also in the idea that's in Clytemnestra and in Electra, of the relationship between power, powerlessness, and voice. And this is something I think that matters enormously here at the moment, as to who gets to speak. and who listens to them and what tone they use when they speak. And I used quite a lot of this in The Testament of Mary, which is a play and a novel about Mary, the mother of Jesus, that if you repress somebody and then if they speak, their speech will have a very particular texture and tone which will come from powerlessness into power as though they might only get to speak once. And you will get a sort of exhilaration in speech, or a sort of fluency, or indeed a heightened speech. That this happens especially in something like Antigone, for example, where when Crayon speaks, it's like legislation. It's dull. You don't pay attention to his tone. But the minute she comes on the stage, you watch her, because she's going to speak now. And her speech is filled with drama. But that can only happen when she hasn't spoken before and will not be allowed to speak in the future. When she has been silent and will be silenced again. So that all of those ideas remain, I think, whirling around in any country where there are inequalities, or any country where there are people silenced. And so I'm afraid to say that all of this is oddly relevant, and and I did find, I have to say that I took it on, and halfway through I did find it frightening. It wasn't. I mean, getting a character like Orestes, who's so lovable in a certain way, to actually kill his mother was not a great way of spending an afternoon.
Hi, thank you very much. I'm a big fan. I noticed that a theme in a lot of your work is the idea of killing one's mother. I just love to hear you respond to that. What does that mean to you?
Look, I wrote a book called New Ways to Kill Your Mother, and honestly, I mean, along the way, it was called New Ways to Kill Your Father. It just got changed. No one can remember how that occurred, but it's a book of essays about writers and their families. So it's that whole idea of, especially in Ireland, but in other countries too, of a writer being seen as quintessentially treacherous. And someone like John Millington Synge, who wrote some of the early plays for the Abbey Theatre, his mother really, really read the Bible, but she certainly didn't go to the theatre. She disapproved deeply of the theatre. And then you have her son, John, whom she loved, actually going out every day to go to the theatre, of all things, nearly killed her, and did kill her in the end, so that his working with actresses, his bringing these illusions onto the stage, really was a way of killing his mother. His father had died just before that, but there are other essays that are about new ways to kill your father. So that there's that whole idea of writing as a way of betraying or of really frightening people who are close to you, and especially in a very conservative society. And I mean, the relationship, say, between the poet Hart Crane and his father. There are moments in that correspondence where you feel he was trying to kill his father when he was writing those poems. And so that really the only time I've dealt with this before was in putting the title, that unfortunate title, onto that book, which I have to say did not help its sort of, it did not help it commercially. In other words, it was not... There were, I'm not making this up, a few people who said, it's exactly the book my mother needs to read just now. But these people were few and far between. And I hope never to, it's a subject I hope not to return to.
Can you talk about the gradual disillusionment that the ancient Greeks came to feel about the power of their gods? And you bring this up in your novel.
It's a technical problem that I had in the novel, which is that the novel, as a form, tends in general to be a secular space. And you really cannot use the gods over and over in a novel. So that all you have to do is think about it, that if you had Jane Austen saying, God that morning told Mr. Darcy that he and Mr. Bingley should ride their horses over towards the girls. And later on, it was only when Elizabeth prayed that Lady Catherine de Bourgh was sent on her way. You know, while the novels are filled with clergymen they're so filled instead of spirituality or transcendence with money, with desires, people wanting to marry for money or love or the next generation. And I think if you could imagine that scene in Portrait of a Lady where Isabel Archer is up all night, and there's almost a religious sense to it, but there isn't. I mean, because she doesn't kneel down and pray and ask God, please tell me what Osmond has really been up to. It's the Countess Gemini who tells her. So that when I was planning this book and plotting it out, I realized if I let the gods into every bit of this book, if I have every moment a god coming up or down or arriving or saying this or that, I will lose the novel, because you will stop thinking the characters have choices and chances. You will stop thinking about their human qualities, and you will start thinking about their relationship to the gods. So that very early on, once Iphigenia has been sacrificed, what I have to have is Clytemnestra realizing that that was nonsense, that the wind changed because he was lucky. That's all that happened. And she has to move in this novel from an entire society believing fully in the power of this to herself that believes only in her own will, that she will decide what actions she performs. And this is why Electra is in such a rage with her. Who said you could kill my father? What god did you appeal to? Clytemnestra said, no god. I decided. And it comes up again when Leander asks Orestes, who said you could kill your mother? And Electra interjects to say, the gods, we appeal to the gods. And he said, that's over, that's finished with. And what I was partly using there was Wagner's Ring, was that idea of the death of the gods that occurs throughout those operas. There's a moment in Siegfried when Erda, who's an earlier wife of Wotan, and she's buried in the earth. She's a figure of deep wisdom. She's the mezzo or the contralto, and she's got a deeply wise voice. And he goes to find her, to consult her, to say, what is happening to us? I saw a production once, in fact, where she was in an apartment building, and he actually presses a bell in the apartment building, and she comes down on the elevator. But in most productions, she comes up from the earth with this extraordinary voice. And it takes about 45 minutes, but she explains to Wotan that his power is waning, that he's living in a time when the great power of the gods will actually go. So I was using that, but I was also using elements that I have witnessed in Ireland with Catholicism seeming to be on the wane, or at least religious practice or deep religious devotion, or people really listening to priests and bishops, all of that fading from an earlier time that I remember very well, when it was, the churches were packed with people and the people were filled with devotion and they listened to everything the priest said, to a time now when people are really looking at their watches, that they're either not at Mass at all, or they're looking at their watches and thinking about shopping. Yeah.
I was remembering when you were reading the poem of a line from the Testament of Mary, where you talk about the physical ugliness of the apostles. And I was curious to know what relationship the physical attractiveness of the characters you write about plays, because I thought that was something very interesting in that novel.
Yeah, well, it wasn't their physical ugliness, it's as much how their voices that they annoyed her. She describes them as being misfits. But it wasn't that there was something actual physically wrong with them. It wasn't that they were too small, too tall, or violently ugly or anything. It was just that their presence in her house with her son, they struck that it wasn't the ordinary ones didn't come, the misfits came. And so I don't think, I tend in general in novels not to describe anyone physically. The reason for that is that you make a pact with the reader, that you're entering the reader's imagination, and you have to give the reader a sort of an autonomy to imagine the characters physically. And if you go on too much, for example, in Brooklyn, you don't know whether she's small. I mean, obviously in the movie you can see everything, but in the novel you don't learn whether she's small or tall or what color her hair is or her eyes. that is absolutely left blank in the novel. And that's a deliberate way of allowing the reader to imagine her. But I think even in the Testament of Mary, with the figure, say, of Jesus, he's not described physically. I mean, his face or his hair or anything else about him. And it's the same in this book, that there's the big physical thing is that Orestes, when he comes back, his friend, Orestes sees his friend who's come back from war with a big gash down the side of his face. He's obviously been in battle. But that's the nearest thing, I think, to a moment where a physical thing is described in the novel. And I think it's very important. It's one of the reasons why I really hate when a publisher puts a photograph of something on the front of a character, because that's the last thing you want. You want the reader to do the imagining. So for example, with Nora Webster, I think we just got them to put the back of a character so the reader could do the work.
That's loud. Thank you for that wonderful talk. I had a short question and a long question. I was wondering what's a book or a piece of writing that you haven't mentioned yet that would, you think, pair nicely with House of Names? That's the short question. And the longer question is, I was wondering how a Greek audience reacted not to the egregious violence on stage, whether they had a sense of transgression that we have. And I ask that in the context of what horror means and what we think horror means. You know, when you read or you watch something on television about the Syrian war, you think, oh, that's horrible, and then you turn off the TV and shake your head and walk away. And then there's actually being in that moment of horror and knowing what it means and feels like to be horrified.
Yeah. I think with the second question, we have to take the idea of catharsis really seriously. And we have to say that these events were enacted and reenacted in order to fill the audience with pity and terror, in order to give the audience a sense of their enormity and power, of what they felt like and looked like. Now, we may be wrong about this. I mean, we're talking about thousands of years ago. The audience may have responded differently. But this, we presume, was ritual. And this was ritual for a very good reason, was in order, for example, to bring certain things into the open so they could be fully felt and seen. And this is exactly the same reason as you write in novels, so that so that instead of being able to turn off the TV, in that second where whatever is in the corner just seems like something was on yesterday as well, that you're attempting to capture the reader's imagination. So the reader will turn the page and the reader will start to feel what you have been feeling, so that the act of writing is an act of communication, and that you're attempting to slow time down, to show what something is actually like in slow motion for whoever did it or whoever suffered it, or indeed whoever looked on. And that there may be, in fact, a connection between the idea that I have of an audience in Greek theatre gathered together for the ritual of theatre, feeling the horror of what's being presented to them in full. It's being presented to them in full as horror. Not in order necessarily to stop. You know, it's not as though one is involved in a crusade to stop what is happening, but to make sure that it does not happen without everyone registering. This is what it was like for those involved in it. It was not something that you can put out of your mind just because you want to. I have you now. I've captured you by virtue of my words. I'm holding you as long as I can, because I need you to know what this was like for these people I have imagined. So perhaps there is a connection between the two things. In relation to, in the making of Orestes, I was certainly aware of figures like the Verloc in Joseph Conrad's The Secret Agent, or Hyacinth Robinson in Henry James's Princess Cassie-Massima. Those figures who were caught in acts of terrorism, in which they seemed to be, other people seemed to be pulling the strings or egging them on, and they were the weak ones who were caught in that way. So I was using those ideas of somebody who's in between two sorts of power, who themselves are oddly innocent, oddly powerless, but then, because of their blankness, fully lethal once a weapon gets into their hands.
First of all, thank you for an outstanding presentation. And I also wanted to thank you for reading those powerful poems by Yeats. I wanted to know if James Joyce and Ulysses had also been something that inspired you or that you were dialoguing with in this incredible novel.
Now, look, I'm really glad you asked that question because, of course, in the middle of all of this, born in 1882 is James Joyce. And he is attempting to find a myth which will govern the great novel he wants to write. And he has written some poems. He has written a book of stories called Dubliners. They're in a style he calls the style of scrupulous meanness to describe the ordinary life. What he calls it, a chapter in the moral history of my country. And he writes a portrait of the artist as a young man. And he writes a play called Exiles. But now what he wants to do is to write a great book, a book almost that will put an end to other books. And it will be a day in the life of Dublin. It will be intensely personal. It will be the 16th of June, 1904. It's set only in that day, which was the first day that he walked out with the woman with whom he spent the rest of his life, who was Nora Barnacle. So it's commemorating that day in his life. But he needs something else for it. And he uses the Odyssey. You know, he goes back to the Greeks. In other words, even though he wanted nothing to do with Lady Gregory, and he really dismissed what I've been talking about there, that whole idea of translation for the purposes of building a nation. And he really laughed at it. And even in Ulysses, he makes fun of it. But, and he told Yates even, "You're too old, there's nothing I can do for you." I mean, he was the most arrogant young man, but he needed one thing more. In a way, in the same way as Ireland had needed one thing more, one other country who had used its ancient past as a way of liberating itself from an empire, that Ireland had used Greece. And Joyce then actually went and found that he could base his book on the Odyssey, and that would be the governing myth, that when he was seeking form and structure for his own book, he would just look at the original to see what were they doing. And he could, instead of them being heroes, he could make Leopold Bloom, his everyman figure, do it in a much less heroic way. So it's almost an ironic commentary on heroism, but he's using the Greek throughout, the Greek form, and he's calling the chapters, for example, Ithaca or Cyclops, after the chapters of the Odyssey. So yeah, he is the figure. I just didn't have time to go into in any detail. That there's Wilde, there's Yeats, there's Lady Gregory, but I think the big one was Joyce. So thanks for asking that.
Well, I read this along with Edith Hamilton, so I would know all the mythology of the people. And I missed Leander. I don't know where you got Leander. And I'd also love to know a good biography of Lady Gregory. She sounds quite incredible.
Oh, there are some biographies of Lady Gregory. I'm sorry to say that I wrote one of them, and it's actually called Lady Gregory's Toothbrush, and it's published, I think, here by the University of Wisconsin Press, and. Yeah, it should be listed there, but it's a short biography. There are probably better ones that are longer, but mine is anyway is also there. I added a great deal to this story, and I took what I needed from the originals, and then it was clear that Orestes has a friend, but the friend really doesn't really have any agency in the originals. So so he is entirely invented. Ianthe, his sister, his grandfather, all of his family is completely from me. And Mitros and all his family and all the old woman episode, all of that is mine. So the basic story is there, and then I felt free to work with it. So it isn't, as it were, a translation or even a transliteration. It's an effort to find something in the story and then build on that to see where it would take me. So it's not a faithful translation. It's a novelist at work. In other words, it's a work of imagination. So thank you very much, everybody. Thank you. Thank you.